Broadcasting live. It's America's longest running talk show on computers. It's Computer America, bringing you the biggest names in technology with guest interviews, new products, and your emails. Listen live at computeramerica.com on any device around the world. Email the show at live@computeramerica.com or find us on social media. Be sure to check out our website for contests, giveaways, show notes, live video stream, podcasts, and more. You're listening to Computer America.
Hello and welcome into the Computer America Show. We are the nation's longest running, nationally syndicated radio talk show on computers and technology. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Ben Crossman, and I hope all of you are having a wonderful day out there because we have a wonderful show lined up for you where we are going to be talking about security, some of the biggest security threats out there on the market right now. And I say market pointedly because, hey, these things are up for sale and making sure that they stay out of, the wrong people's hands. It's big business. So, hey, it's going to be a great interview today with a company known as Virsec. But before we get to them, a couple of things to mention, including computeramerica.com. That's where you'll find everything and anything having to do with today's show. So be that a link to our guest website, any articles that we do, any videos that we check out, anything and everything are right there. So if you are driving or you're busy, well, you can go to our website and, hey, we got you covered. Let's see. While you're there, also be sure to check out the video footage of the show. So you can, hey, of course, check out the live video stream brought to you by OWC and check out the social media contest brought to you by Logitech. You can check that out as well. So with all that being said, I think we're just going to go ahead and jump right into this. And so joining us today is the one, the only Mr. Willy Leichter, and he is the Vice President of Marketing for Virsec. And Willy, how you doing? Welcome onto Computer America.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me. Very excited about being here and talking about a lot of these very broad and technical issues.
Yeah, it's and of course we'll fill everyone in as we go because I'm sure we would even lose myself if we kind of dove right into it. But happy that you could join us, and I think you guys are a great company. So we're gonna break this down really, really well. So a little bit of background on Virsec. Kind of how long have they been in the industry of keeping people safe and companies safe, and then a bit about yourself. How did you find yourself working with the company?
Great. Well, thanks again, Ben. So Virsec is a new company. We're a startup, certainly by Silicon Valley terms, although we've been building our technology for about 3 years now. We have a very different approach to security from most other companies, and we can get more into it. But essentially, we are looking at core applications and trying to protect them from the inside out, as opposed to most security, which is still at the perimeter, even though the perimeter is disappearing, trying to keep bad stuff from coming in. And I can talk more about what that means. But we're in a hot space. Security is big business all around. It's big business for the hackers. Of course, huge amounts of money and other livelihoods are at stake. And the security industry is a big industry. I have been in this industry for close to 20 years now for a range of different security companies. And if I step back, it's kind of fascinating because I don't know of any other technology industries where it stays broken and it seems to not be getting fixed. Even though companies have invested billions of dollars in this, the problems just keep going. And I guess if you think about it more as adversarial, cyber warfare is not an exaggeration. It's always this back and forth, one-upsmanship of, the good guys and the bad guys.
No, very well said. And that's something that we have definitely seen because you mentioned something about a perimeter, and we have security professionals on the show every once in a while. And I think it's that idea that's developing, really, I don't know if all of you go to the same conference and the terminology just kind of spreads as it will, but the idea that you can stop everything seems to be going away. That's the fever dream of a madman. Now you are minimizing and reducing and patching as best you can, but the idea of a perfect world seems out of reach. So Why don't we go ahead?
Yeah,
Yep. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
sorry, just respond to that. And I think I think we need to rethink a lot of these things. As you mentioned, the perimeter, people have been talking for years about the perimeter disappearing, as we know, because of the cloud, because of applications, because of all the interconnectivity. Yet our basic security model is still essentially layers of perimeter security. And what I mean by that is they're effectively looking outwards, looking at the bad stuff coming in, which seems logical. Bad stuff's coming in, try to stop it. But that is kind of a fool's errand. It's a game we will never win. And a lot of people, and you're right, people in the industry do repeat the same things. It's a relatively small industry. But there is this concept emerging that instead of always chasing the bad, we're always chasing the bad and we're never catching up, we need to focus on ensuring good. And by that, I mean ensuring that applications, processes do the right thing, regardless of what bad stuff is out there, because we'll never have this pristine world where, threats don't come in and flaws don't exist.
Right. And I guess that's what you guys do there. So, but how do you go about doing that? I mean, is it sitting around waiting for someone to attack someone and then analyze how it happened? Or is it a more proactive approach? Do you work with other companies? Just what exactly does Virsec, how do they go about their business?
Yeah, so I'll give you the high level version of it. This stuff does get very technical very quickly, but conceptually, if you think about a program, you think about compiled code. You've written an application. It may be millions of lines. It may be complicated, but it is predictable. And particularly at the memory level, a lot of people talk now about fileless attacks. You're not sending viruses anymore in a file or on a disk. There are fileless techniques, very sophisticated ways to manipulate legitimate processes, especially at the memory level. The simplest way to explain it is if you're going from block 100 to block 200, that's your assigned memory location. If something tricks that into going to block 300, that data is now in an area where it's not supposed to be in it, and it is exposed. So we have a patented process where we are mapping the assigned memory locations as a program loads into memory. And then if it does something else, it's bad. It's really more of a deterministic process. Most of the outward-facing security is kind of probabilistic. And people are talking a lot about using AI tools and things like that to look at more data. That's all fine, but it's still an infinite problem, and you're guessing at it, even if you're at 99%. A lot gets through. What we do is we look at these processes that are predictable, that are very much telltale signs of attacks in progress. Now, you also asked about prevention versus reacting. It's always sounds better to say we prevent attacks. Unfortunately, no one can do that 100%. But what you can do is you can react extremely quickly to any indicators of attack. And attacks are not monolithic. They happen through a whole range of things that are interconnected, stealing passwords, getting command and control of a server, moving laterally, all these things. There's multiple steps, multiple footprints. So if you can detect any one of them and react extremely quickly to cut off the bad guy, alert people, a whole range of things, that's a huge advantage. Right now, the reaction time can be days and there can be terabytes of data to get through, but we're able to pinpoint these things very precisely, which also changes the dynamic quite a bit.
So, and let's get into some real world instances of this, because when you get, kind of high level like that, it sounds like,
yes,
we're doing our best. And, if there's enough people doing their best, then nothing can ever happen. But that doesn't seem to be the case. One of the first instances you wanted to bring up here happened. And if you could talk about how this happened and, just how they were affected. But I mean, Delta, Sears, and a lot of other companies, it seems like every couple of weeks we hear about another multi-million customer data leak or something like that. What happened with Delta? What happened with Sears and their customers' data being exposed?
Yeah, so you're right. It's just a litany. I mean, if you open your wallet, you're hard pressed to find a store or credit card or service that hasn't been hacked recently. It seems like, let alone taking an Uber. Let me step back a little bit, because there are a number of different overlapping issues here. Now, I think specifically with Delta and Sears, and every week there's something new, so It's hard to keep track of them, and frankly, breach fatigue is a problem. But if we look at these are basically relying on a third party to take care of your data. And that's necessary often, but I think as an industry, we are way too casual about that. And we're seeing new laws like in Europe, the GDPR is coming up this month, actually. I think we're going to see strengthening of privacy laws where you can't just use a whole range of subcontractors without very strict controls on what they do. Now, it's easy to say, well, it didn't happen to us. It was them. They made a mistake. Oops, we're sorry. But that shouldn't be good enough. So holding the top level company accountable for what their subcontractors are doing is important. Now, the specifics of the leak are always hard to tell, and they're almost, less interesting, frankly, than the responsibility and how people are being held accountable, because stuff does happen. Inevitably, things will leak. There's a big trend, and I don't know if it applies to these two, but a lot of leaks recently, particularly with third parties, have happened where people are putting data into Amazon Web Services or other cloud storage devices. Incredibly convenient, easy to do, a credit card, you can set up any kind of server, but you don't get security by default. So it's incredibly easy for, even smart mid-level people with access to sensitive data to put it up in the cloud where it will be scanned, guaranteed within minutes, and then it's exposed. So I think that's a big part of this. Beyond just the disappearing perimeter, we're now using these very extended networks of services, and for the most part, we don't know where this data is. So I think data privacy also needs to be rethought in terms of how much we're trusting as consumers, we're trusting companies.
That's an interesting way to put it, because I feel like just like we tell about small, medium businesses here on the show, you may be a catering company, you may be a dry cleaner, many, 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 many industries just, they don't want to provide data services. They don't want to be the back end for their own website. They bake cookies. They don't manage, all these different permissions and all these different databases and things like that. And I think at some level, of course, we can expect very, very large companies to do the same, but they're in the same boat. Starbucks is not, internet infrastructure. So for them to kind of offload everything to Amazon or Google or one of these other large, providers, I mean, is that really something that we can fault them for? And is that something that we, why hasn't security been a priority for these large, web services providers?
Yeah, and there are multiple layers to this this topic, but I'll take a stab at it.
Sure.
So first of all, I think companies are starting to be smarter about taking as little customer information as possible, because it's a liability. It's a risk that you shouldn't take if you don't need. Or if you need someone's name and address, don't take their date of birth. Don't require passwords. The holding of that data is becoming much larger responsibility. I would say more broadly, frankly, and I've done a lot of work both in the U.S. and in Europe, where there are very different perspectives about privacy. The GDPR is a whole other topic we can talk about, but this is a very broad data protection law that's going to come into effect later this month. It's been years in the making throughout Europe, and anybody who touches European data globally. Now, in Europe, there is much more of a constitutional right to privacy. So people are much more careful about it. And they have recourse, and now they're going to have stronger laws. We don't have that same kind of concept here. We don't have this kind of ingrained legal right to privacy, even though we all have very strong, gut feelings that we want to have privacy. And until that starts to change, most companies have been, pretty casual, because they're doing their business and they're not doing bad things per se or bad intent.
Right.
But if you're not, required to be careful, lots of people won't be.
I guess that's one way to look at it. But Okay, another side of this is, of course, being secure, doing the best you can. That's great, and we expect a certain level of that. And then you have the other part, the response to the hacking, and that's another part I always like to bring up. And I wanted your reasoning why I feel like there's a gap here, because a lot of these hacks that we hear about are 3, 4, 5, 6 months after the fact. In some cases, such as Uber, and you can comment as a security professional. Would you recommend paying the extortion money? That's another kind of talk about what happened with Uber. But I mean, there's preventing people, which is harder and harder. We get that. What should the response be, and how quickly should it come? Because we see some legislation working its way through that. It happened like a month or two ago. They proposed that if you have to announce the hack within 5 days of you learning it, and that's very far from months upon months that we have in the past. That's the kind of exposure that we get. And we'll move on from there. But just tackle that. What is the appropriate
Sure.
response?
Well, actually, couple things I wanted to point out. I was a little bit saying, Europeans have better privacy laws. We don't. But a lot of these concepts around data privacy actually originated in the U.S. with HIPAA and with the California breach notification law from 20 years ago. So ironically, many of the concepts around users and data privacy have originated there. So we have a model with healthcare information that I think we really need to consider applying more broadly in terms of specific called out rights, requirements to protect things. Now, I also want to make a quick point on ransomware. That's a great question. Should you pay a ransom? And it's easy to take the grandstand approach, like, of course not. You're just, feeding the beast and they're going to come back. You're painting a bullseye on your back. You never pay a target. But talk to someone who's just lost their whole hard drive with, all their company's data, and they're desperate. I don't blame them for trying to pay a ransom. Now, what Uber did is far beyond that and unconscionable, because they didn't pay a ransom. They paid the hacker to basically be quiet.
Right.
They paid hush money. There's no other way to talk about it. And that is actually a violation of existing privacy laws. All the breach notification laws around the country, they violated clearly. Now, you do get into more gray area when you ask how soon is soon enough. So, an incident happens. You may not know about it for a while. When it is discovered, you do want to do some legitimate research and understand it. So I would say, in most cases, maybe, a month would be a reasonable window for a company to then go public. But all the examples, Equifax, Uber, dozens of them, they exist for months. And there seems to usually be a cycle. It's like the, denial and then acceptance. The companies first want to do everything they can to avoid the disclosure. I think the breach notification laws that started in California now are in, I think, 48 states. Those have been incredibly powerful and have forced a lot of better behavior, because it is, public vilification of a company for a breach. But I think there's a lot of different interpretations about how fast or how soon is soon enough. Now, are those effective? I think to a point, but they don't solve everything. But I think it's a good starting point to require consistent notification when there is a breach.
And I guess, because you deal with companies, you deal with, the larger entities, but who's really affected is not so much the company that is hacked. It's not about Starbucks and their coffee's going to go bad. It's about the fact that their customers, maybe they might lose faith in Starbucks, but they're the ones walking around with a compromised credit card. They're the one who are now on the on the email spam list. They're the ones hurt. So about a month is a bit longer than I usually hear, but I guess companies just have to understand that it's, it's their stock price, but it's also their customers that are truly the ones who are compromised.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to not know for a month that I was hacked, but we're seeing so many examples of, 3 months, 6 months, a year. So
you
I
think
would
that
say
you
a
should just
month
assume
at the outset.
So you think that just as a consumer, you should assume your information is out there at some point, and you should do some basic monitoring?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, and I've seen live demos from white hat, formerly black hat hackers, where they're going on the dark web, buying credit card numbers, passwords, social security numbers, bank account information with Bitcoins within a matter of minutes. I think, unfortunately, we all have to assume our data is out there, and we all have to take, every recommended security step if you care about your credit and you care about not being, not having stuff stolen.
Right. So let's talk about what they can do to kind of protect themselves, because that's your area. Your area is to, either better assess the risk and handle them, or stop them from coming. I mean, are there some basic practices that people gloss over? What can they do better?
So from a consumer standpoint, follow the basics. They sound, like you always hear them over and over, but two-factor authentication is extremely effective at cutting down a lot of loss. The chips now used on our credit cards, those really get rid of counterfeit credit cards, not online, but physical credit cards. It's been ridiculously slow in coming with businesses. I would not use a credit card where they don't have a chip reader, magnetic scan. I would say don't shop there or pay in cash. Beyond that, I think we get into, if I shift a little bit back to the technology, there's not an easy cure here, and it is challenging for the average person not to feel breach fatigue and just think this is overwhelming. I can't do anything. I'm going to go live in a cave somewhere. Obviously, we all have to keep going about our lives, but I think businesses do legitimately need to rethink how they are securing data, what data they're holding, and how they're protecting critical applications. Because the other big force, the force that changes everything, big cliche, but the cloud, and more specifically that big companies are outsourcing their infrastructure in dramatic fashion. Everybody is using Amazon. No one wants to go buy a server anymore. They're building virtual private clouds. It's just a much better compute model, but it explodes the whole, eggshell model we used to have about security, the perimeter approach, where you keep the good stuff in, keep the bad guys out.
Right.
Now, you can't define a perimeter very well. So, assume that, accept that, and then you have to think about what are the areas where you can make sure the right thing is happening. And a lot of them are around data, first of all. We talked a lot about that, just more responsibility. But the applications that are running data are now the battleground, particularly at the memory level, at levels that are below the radar. Spectre and Meltdown are a great example of new attacks that were so far below the radar, no one could even conceive about it, even security experts, until it happened. So you have to stay vigilant, and you have to essentially do everything you can to assure that your applications are doing the right thing, performing properly, and instrument it to let you know immediately if something wrong is happening. Now, there's always a challenge with false positives. Any system that is giving you lots of alerts, if more than say 10% are false alarms, or say 50% are false alarms, the noise drowns out the signal very quickly. When we think about the Target attack from a couple years ago, all the alerts were there, but there was so much other noise. Plus, it was Black Friday weekend; no one was going to shut down their point of sale displays. But the alerts have to be accurate, otherwise they get ignored pretty quickly. But focusing on this application centric side, application and data, and trying to protect it, from the inside, or I use an analogy. If you're sending your kids out into the world, you're not going to make the world secure, but you are going to do everything you can to make sure that they are educated, smart, know how to protect themselves, and any kind of, physical and mental protection you can give them, you certainly want to do.
Right, and you want to make yourself again, to use the phrases I've heard, you want to make yourself a harder target. You don't want soft targets just roaming around out there. Kids, kids with the hats and the little beanies being grabbed into white vans. It's not what you want. You want very
Exactly.
big, beefy kids. So,
And harder targets and actually smaller targets, meaning the attack surface area. People talk about a lot. If you minimize the surface area, and that comes back to understanding where your data is going and who's touching it, and particularly with third-party processors. That's just surface area that you're giving away to hackers.
Right. So, and you actually mentioned a couple that we have some news here today. We had this article that we were going to talk about later, but hey, no time like the present. If you head on over to, of course, your guys' website, Virsec, Virsec.com, we have a link to it in the show notes. But you mentioned here that your firm is, one of the only ones out there with that protects applications from Spectre and Meltdown. And so if we could get a quick overview, I know it's, not the easiest thing, of Spectre and Meltdown and why these continue, because I think they were announced in late January or early February, and they haven't really gone away. In fact, like I said today, more news coming out. Why is this such a big problem?
And yes, I'll try to give you a reasonably understandable view. First of all, I was at the RSA show 2 weeks ago, the big security conference, and frankly, I was very surprised that hardly any security vendors were talking about it, even though this is one of the biggest things in the news. And I think it's largely because it's just below the radar or below any place that they play. Someone used the term that, why didn't we discover this? It's a failure of imagination. No one thought this could happen. So in the simplest terms, Spectre and Meltdown, there's a lot of variants of it, but in simplest terms, they're all about this concept called speculative execution. This goes back to the mid-90s, literally the first Pentium chip. As the processors got faster and faster, as code is being processed and caching data and doing all kinds of elaborate things, there are security checks that are built into every step. But the processors are getting faster than all the other memory and feeds surrounding them. So when they've done all their tasks and they're waiting for data to come from something else or something else to happen, they will jump ahead 10, 20 commands and start processing the next thing. If they're waiting for a variable, they don't know what it is, they'll guess. This is typical of caching. You can probably guess 75% of the time right and increase performance dramatically by processing things out of order, not necessarily in the order they arrive. But the problem is that they skipped important security steps. And while this brief, jump ahead of, service someone else in line while the other people are waiting, essentially, they've bypassed some security checks. And they figured, well, it'll all come out in the wash. By the time we get to the right place and things are back in order, we will have done everything. But this brief window is exploitable, and it has been exploited. This started as almost an academic research paper back in January, and some people were kind of dismissive that this is really arcane and hard to do. But they published it. We've reproduced it. We were actually running it live at RSA in a contained machine. Mm-hmm. It is very real. It's sophisticated, no doubt, but it's very real. And this vulnerability exists in, I don't know what percent, but billions and billions of processors, phones, anything with an Intel or an AMD or ARM chip, literally from the last 20 years. Potentially has this vulnerability.
Yeah, and just to be clear, because that's a part that, depending on which article you read, that goes back and forth, is that Intel, of course, you mentioned all the way back to the first Pentium, so 10 plus years of the most popular CPU manufacturer, so you got that, but also, AMD themselves said that they weren't vulnerable, and then some said that, some exploits that were affecting these are available to AMD. Could you just kind of lay it out there for AMD and, and ARM processors, and if they're actually affected by some or all?
So I don't know all the specifics in it, but the reaction was not very well handled across the board. It's partly because this was so unprecedented. I think it exists in the vast majority of chips in theory. Now, I'm confident the chip manufacturers will be able to build better chips that don't do this and make up for the performance in other places. But to get rid of all this 23 years of vulnerable processors will take years, and there'll always be old ones out there.
And Willy, I've stopped you right there. The music means we're going to take a break. Would you mind staying over so we can finish up this?
Absolutely, be happy to, Ben.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And everyone, we're talking to Mr. Willy Leichter. He is the Vice President of Marketing for Virsec. Everyone, stay tuned. Computer America right after this.
Greece is cheap.
But the airfare costs a fortune.
Paris?
Not much closer, and again, airfare...
What about Puerto Vallarta?
Let's face it, flying anywhere is just too expensive.
Wait, what's this? Low-cost airlines.
With one call to low-cost airlines, you'll drastically slash your travel costs. We're talking insanely low airline prices to any of your favorite destinations. Where would you like to go? London, Rome, Costa Rica, Australia?
Wow, that's cheap.
So why wait? Call now to learn how crazy cheap it is to fly anywhere in the U.S. or international. Our prices are so low, we can't publish them. The only way to get them is to call to instantly hear the most amazing best deals on airline travel. It's that easy. So call now and start packing.
800-215-4461. 800-215-4461. 800-215-4461. That's 800-215-4461.
We are all Brother Wolf. 10 years ago, a group of locals banded together to create positive change. We took animals into our homes, held adoption events at local retailers, and talked to the community about our mission to help build a no-kill Asheville. A decade later, we have achieved so many victories for animals in need. There's been so much progress, yet there's still so much to do. As part of our year-long celebration, we encourage you to become a member of our special Compassionate Circle program. With a monthly donation of $10 or more, you will have behind-the-scenes access to the work we are doing at Brother Wolf. Our goal is to reach 1,000 members because we receive no government funding. Working together, we can help build and sustain no-kill communities. Learn more at compassionatecircle.bwar.org. We are a 501c3 tax-deductible organization.
Hello and welcome back into the Computer America Show. We are going to go ahead and continue on with Virsec. And but before we do that, a couple of things to mention, or at least one thing, is that if you missed any part of today's episode and you wanted to hear it in its entirety, feel free to go wherever podcasts are heard, be that iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Blog Talk Radio, wherever. And yeah, the show in its entirety will be put up there after the program. And yeah, you can listen to anything that you missed or just, hey, stay caught up that way. And so with that being said, we're going to go ahead and continue on with Willy Leichter. He is the Vice President of Marketing for Virsec. And Willy, we kind of had to cut you off there, but you were just getting into the fact that AMD, I'm sure that certain parts of this, certain parts of these meltdown specter, because they're actually like clusters of vulnerabilities that are still being found out. And it's you mentioned that it's a very basic, it's a very fundamental flaw in these, in that even some of the fixes we've seen from Microsoft and from Intel have caused problems with other applications or even entire operating systems screeching to a halt. Like, they're not easy to fix from a software level, but from a physical future hardware level, things are going to be okay. Talk about the implications of having 10 years of, and especially 10 years of, kind of technology explosion where everything has a chip in it, and a lot of those chips are vulnerable to these flaws. I mean, talk about the impact of having 10 years of legacy hardware that is going to be vulnerable for who knows how long.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for letting me go overtime here, Ben. Appreciate it. So it's a gnarly big problem that will take a long time to solve. I guess that's the bottom line. You mentioned the patches were, a disaster. All kinds of unintended consequences, both from the operating system kernel level. Microsoft tried to patch it, Intel release patches, lots and lots of unintended consequences. We could do a whole nother show on patching because patching is viewed as the universal solution to everything. Mm-hmm. Most companies avoid patching if they can because it breaks stuff and because they, you leave something alone when it's working. And in industrial control space, there are many things that are unpatchable. So I won't stray too far there, but the patches have not worked to date. Now, this thing is developing and morphing and growing as all of these exploits do. So there were three initial. There were Spectre 1 and 2 and Meltdown, all related to speculative execution. There are new ones emerging now. The core problem is there. It may not be exposed in every processor. We hope not. But the core problem is there. And these attackers they're brilliant and they're well funded, they're well organized. Assume these are, the equivalent of our NSA research scientists who are looking for these incredibly subtle flaws, sharing information. Of course, Spectre was published. So it's naive to think that it will just go away or it's not going to affect you. It won't affect everyone, of course, but it is a significant, I would say it's not a huge hole, but it's a small hole in almost every device out there. So either way you measure it.
And I think to be clear, it's a small, well, you kind of mentioned it's a small hole, and I don't think anyone has figured out how to take these and actually write things to memory to make them run any kind of code. Although I think I do remember something about that. But anyways, Spectre, it's kind of named as Spectre because it just kind of lurks there and it looks at things. Like you can read the memory, but you can't, not every single device or server out there is suddenly able to be, seized by any entity with a piece of code, right? Like it's just
that's correct.
Reading.
And that's correct. But, reading means leaking data.
Yeah,
so, and, reading small amounts of data repeatedly, you can get a lot of information. A small leak in a pipe can cause big damage. This is really a data loss risk. And there have been demonstrated ways to read. It's another type of memory attack. Essentially, they're exposing data where it's not supposed to be in shared memory within a processor. So this is fairly deep down, but it is doable and it's accessible. And like I said, we built it at RSA and we're demonstrating it live. Now, let me just talk a little bit. Let me shift gears. I'll talk about how we approach the problem. So it's one of these big problems that's not going to go away soon. And we are not claiming to solve the problem by any means, but we are back to our view that we can build mechanisms that can detect when this is happening, and we can actually selectively stop this speculative execution. So if there's some vulnerable code that's something important and we can tell that it's going to do this jumping out of order execution, we can selectively fence that off, which is an effective way to do this. Now, if you just turn off this capability, the other downside is you lose about 30% of your performance. The reason they did this is a huge performance increase, like most caching. So just turning it off isn't very satisfactory, and the patches haven't worked, and waiting for hardware will take years. But we can do this very strategically and selectively, and essentially detect and stop the effects of these exploits or the channels that these exploits are using. And that's a more practical approach. It comes back to our basic philosophy that assume bad stuff is out there and all over the place and leaking in and now coming up from your processors. Assume there are flaws. Not everything is flawed, of course. I don't want to overstate it, but assume there are flaws and protect your applications from being exploited by them. And that we can do. Now, this thing is morphing quickly. It is always an arms race, so there will be new things that we didn't think about. Hopefully there won't be something on the scale of Spectre and Meltdown, but no one saw this coming. But expect once it's out there, it will evolve. Now, if we step back a little bit,
sure.
A lot of these memory-based attacks I was talking about earlier, they were pretty arcane and thought to be pretty obscure like 18 months ago. There was Stuxnet, which was where we or the Israelis supposedly hacked nuclear power plants in Iran, started with a USB. A lot of these sophisticated tools developed by the NSA and other organizations have leaked out, particularly with the shadow brokers. And this is an ongoing slow motion train wreck. So things like double pulsar, eternal blue, dozens and dozens of these very powerful toolkits are now out there, and everybody, the bad guys, are playing with them, using them, adapting them, modifying them. So some of the big news we saw over the last year, WannaCry, NotPetya, InDestroyer, Triton, a long list of these attacks, they all in some capacity have been using these NSA toolkits that facilitate very advanced memory attacks. So, it's a ongoing cyber warfare, but huge amount of valuable information has now escaped to the other side, which just raises the stakes for everyone. So you can't assume that because it's hard to do that it's not going to happen, essentially.
So I feel like scaring people, because that's sometimes that's fun. Atlanta, I'm sure they would have loved services such as yourself a number of months ago. I have not heard any updates. I assume that they are still gridlocked with their own form of ransomware over there in Atlanta. I believe Colorado in the local government there had like 10,000 computers that had to be like rebooted from, reinstalled. Like public utilities, they're obviously getting more connected because it's a convenience factor. Instead of having to send someone out there in a truck, you can, go into a program and click a button. It's a no-brainer to connect infrastructure, cities, vital services to the internet to make them more efficient, and that's something that I think everyone wants. Everyone wants that efficiency and that immediacy. Do
Sure.
you see any kind of threat coming down, because hacking the water treatment plant, I don't think there's going to be a credit card number for you to steal there, but it's important. How do you feel about more municipalities, connecting more services to the internet?
Yeah, great question. And if you want to scare people, think about all these attempted attacks now on power plants, nuclear power plants in some cases, critical infrastructure, the whole industrial control space we're actually very active in. And this is an interesting beast because it's really its own world. Most people in IT security don't really know much about industrial controls and vice versa. But you have very sophisticated system, but it may have been built over the last 30 years, sensors, controllers hooked up to sophisticated control systems that are controlling all of this hardware and making sure terrible things don't happen or even inconvenient things don't happen. This is now clearly a target, and there is a big security gap. A lot of these systems were built around the idea of isolation. They're probably built in the 70s or 80s before there was an internet, just assuming they're off on their own network so no one can get to it. But as you mentioned, there's all kinds of good reasons to connect these systems at some level, even if you have some isolation. Isolation is a disappearing beast because there's always reason to connect things, even to get your virus updates or, for security, you want to be connected. So these isolated systems aren't that isolated anymore, or there may be a USB drive away from being connected to something. And coming back to, I think maybe a way to think about this, I was talking about applications protecting what's important, but if you think about the application being the control system for a power plant, and we work with a company called Schneider Electric, where that's what they build, these control systems for power plants and all kinds of other infrastructure. Small manipulations there turn off a sensor, fool something else, and can have huge implications. So protecting these core critical applications at the center essentially is our approach. And we think that's as important as anywhere with industrial controls.
Right. So, and I think we're going to go ahead and start to wrap this up, but we'll leave one more piece of advice because, Computer America, we're focused mainly on, consumer technology, consumer electronics. So a lot of our audience is, of course, consumers. And, talk businesses, that's great. Definitely enjoy doing it. But as the individual, you mentioned something to the effect of just burnout, just hearing all these bad things that can happen and have been happening. How do consumers, the everyday person, How do you protect yourself from all this? How do you stay safer?
Unfortunately, there's not an easy answer, and it's hard to tell people stay vigilant when you have this onslaught every day, and it's hard. I'm in the business. It's hard to keep track of all of them. But I think you do have some choices to make. I've switched from Uber to Lyft, frankly. Happy to say it, because it's unacceptable what they did. The kind of recklessness and carelessness. Maybe it's an extreme example. Use two-factor authentication wherever possible. Banks offer it now. You get it with Google. It's free almost everywhere. It's very effective way to get a one-time password on your phone to make sure it's you actually logging in. That gets rid of a huge percentage of attack vectors. And then you have to try to reasonably pay attention to what's going on. Limit the personal information you give out. And now that's hard when we were talking about everything's already out there. You could be, sort of fatalistic about and say that's hopeless. But you do still need to limit the personal information you give out. If someone doesn't need it, you don't have to give it to them. And things like there's kind of a cumulative effect with personal information leaking. Someone may have your address. They may have your last name. If they get their phone number, they get your date of birth, you put more and more pieces together and you've got, a profile of someone. And lots of people are putting these pieces together. So it's still worth protecting all of the individual pieces so you're less of a target, I guess.
Makes perfect sense, and I think very sensible, of course, advice. And Willy, I hate to do this to you, but it's been a very interesting 45 minutes, and really thank you for staying over, but we got to wrap it up. So everyone, actually, I'll let you have the last word. If people want to find out more about Virsec, what you guys do, or just more about what we talked about here, where can they go?
So go to our website. We also have blogs on there, and we do a lot of webinars that are not product pitches, but panel discussions with experts. So look on our site for webinars, a lot of interesting topics, because this is not easily solved, but I would tell people not to give up hope. There are ways to do this. We just have to invest more and take it more seriously. And thank you, Ben. This has really enjoyed the opportunity.
Yeah, this has been great. So everyone, again, Virsec, Virsec.com, and we have a link to that in the show notes. It should be up on our homepage for like the next 2 weeks. And Willy, until next time, this has been really informative. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, have a great one. Bye-bye. All right, everyone, so there he goes, and we are going to go ahead and switch on over to computer and technology news, and this is a segment dedicated to all things late-breaking, new, and newsworthy. So here we go, computer technology news, brought to you by OWC. Here we go. All right, so I think for our first article that we're going to do, we have a number here that are pretty important. Let's talk a bit about Hulu. Actually, no, we'll talk about Hulu next. This one first, then Hulu. For everyone out there who has dealt with medical bills, I know that it's not strictly technology, but it's something so absurd that we can't help but just talk about it because it's a bit of a head scratcher. So this one from Ars Technica, which is a great tech site for technology news, but this is just one of those stories that highlights the need for some kind of reform or oversight so bad things don't happen. And this is about a woman who receives a $6,000 ER bill for an ice pack and a bandage. That's right, $6,000, and she didn't even get a CAT scan. There you have it. So they said that once a reporter started to poke his nose into the whole thing, they zeroed out the bill. But they said that a woman seeking treatment from a New Jersey hospital in October 2016 for an ear injury was charged about $6,000 for her treatment, where even though the treatment consisted of an ice pack and a bandage, and they said that the woman, Miss Jessica Pell, had fainted and hit her head on a table, which then, hurt her ear in the process. And she initially went to the emergency department at Hoboken University Medical Center to patch up the injury, but she decided to leave and get the treatment elsewhere after she learned that the doctor who would see her there was out of the network for her insurance plan and would therefore cost more than an in-network doctor. Because, hey, finding network doctors, that's the first thing you do when you're injured. Make sure you don't, make sure your insurance is on point. Anywho, saying that months later, she received a bill from the hospital for her treatment for, again, to the tune of $6,000. Saying that it's for the ice pack and the bandage, that is the only tangible thing that they could bill me for. And the insurance provider estimated that the bill was about 4,453% above what Medicare would have paid for such an ice pack bandage treatment, which is roughly about $129. So a more favorable $130 treatment for ice and an adhesive bandage seems a little high still, but hey, it is what it is. And instead was charged 4,000% more. But because they used a third-party company to estimate a reasonable and appropriate price for the services and agreed to cover $862 of the bill. Because, again, health insurance is what they do, grossly overestimate and then pay even more than what they really should have been paying. So they pushed back, and again, through a reporter, started to ask questions, decided that, hey, it's not worth the bad press that we would get for charging gold prices for ice. So there you go. Again, that one was just so weird that, hey, we like to be reminded sometimes of when things go wrong. So, all right, so there's that one. Let's go ahead and go over to Hulu. So Hulu has been making a lot of traction because Netflix continues to lose they continue to lose the catalog that Hulu is picking up. This because almost every single major cable content provider has a vested interest in Hulu, be it 30%, 10%, somewhere around there. Companies such as like Fox, Time Warner, I think Verizon and Comcast have some stake in it as well. You get these situations where Hulu is getting shows that used to be found on Netflix and people enjoy them. But where Netflix had certain features that Hulu doesn't, they still had some catching up to do. Well, one of those features is finally making its way to Hulu, saying that Amazon Prime and Netflix have both allowed you to download TV episodes to your mobile device and watch them offline. And, well, Hulu will now as well. Saying that the feature is a boon for people who frequently travel or do public transit where there is not a steady internet connection, and others who spend time separated from a speedy internet connection. And as noted, Netflix and Amazon also offer the feature already, but here's a problem. They said that anyone out there who downloads an episode for offline viewing, I think that regardless of what happens, you get the ad version of the show. So ads are included in all offline viewing of Hulu content. So they said that the $8 a month ad-supported tier will actually download the ads right alongside the primary content, and they'll play during the episode the same way they would through the web or a set-top box. So just take note of that. And actually, I take that back. So if you pay $12 for Hulu, you get no ads with your download. So correction there. But yeah, if you have the ad-supported Hulu, you download the ads as well. So Hulu is partially owned by by those broadcast networks, saying that the Walt Disney Company, which owns TV network ABC, owns about 30% of the company. So that's why many of Disney movies are going to Hulu. 21st Century Fox owns about 30%, and Comcast owns another 30%, with Time Warner via Turner Broadcasting System owning 10%. So if you're wondering why all those content providers, again, are pooling their content from Netflix, it's not because Netflix can't make or won't make a deal. It's because Netflix literally can't make a deal. So there you have it. Hulu hasn't said which shows and movies will be available for offline viewing, but Netflix and Amazon currently only offer limited portions of their libraries. And for Netflix, I think it's like any Netflix exclusive because, hey, you don't have to pay extra money if you want to download other people's content, but any network exclusive will probably be available for download. So yeah, I think we're going to leave that there. But again, the big news, Hulu finally joining the others in deciding that, hey, you can indeed, in fact, download your content. And if it's anything like the others, if you've never done it before, you download it, you get like a little token. It verifies every time you connect back to the internet, and it will like kind of delete it after a while. So anyways, let's see. So we have time for just one more story. Why don't we talk about, let's see, MicroSD cards are super interesting. Yeah, let's try to squeeze this one about Airbnb in. So Airbnb has caught flack in the past because people rent out low-income housing, they spruce it up, they do the fixer-upper thing, and because they're cheaper to afford, they then rent them out as a vacation destination. And if you're in a big area, think San Francisco, New York, any of these big cities, you can charge really high rates, but you're going to have availability that's going to rival hotels or, anything else. So, it's going to be a profit maker. And because of that, places where traditionally people of lower incomes would live, think the people that make a city kind of actually function, think of sanitation workers, think of, busboys, think of waitresses, think of just any kind of profession where you aren't earning 20, 25, 30, some of these higher dollar an hour jobs. Yeah, they're being forced out further and further into the suburbs of major cities because their houses, their places where they could actually reasonably afford, they're being purchased, snapped up, and then rented out to vacationers. So we've been hearing this for a while, and this article from Motherboard, I don't think we're going to be able to get to the entire article. It's pretty well researched, but they said that the problem is getting worse. Like, we know it's a problem, and we know it's worse. So just to touch on some points here, they said that let's see here. Okay. The neighborhoods that are currently being impacted are those that cater to either an African American majority or a Hispanic majority of people who live there, and that white neighborhoods systematically bring in more money than non-white neighborhoods. And that's a quote. And from the research that they found, and just in general, again, they're not the ones who are being forced out because, again, they can afford to pay the higher rents. So there's also the issue of taxes. Airbnb is an easy way for hosts to make income without paying taxes. And since there are certain loopholes in the code, the New York Attorney General estimated that the city was missing about $33 million in hotel occupancy taxes from Airbnb rentals between 2010 and 2014. So $33 million up in smoke because of this loophole. And they said that the tax money that could have been invested back into city infrastructure, including public housing. Let's see. So let's go ahead and wrap this up by saying that they have a quote here saying that although inconvenient for this author's anti-home sharing bias, Airbnb supports legislation that would restrict home sharing to one single home, and which would finally allow enforcement to focus on illegal hotel operators while protecting regular New Yorkers who are trying to make some money to live in a city that gets more expensive by the year. And that is, by the way, a statement from Airbnb. Essentially, they're saying they want to protect people, and they hate that this is happening, but at the same time, Airbnb really doesn't prevent it all that much. They're waiting for legislation to do it for them. Anyways, it's a much bigger topic. I probably should have not tried to squeeze it in there at the beginning. But anyways, folks, thank you for joining us here on Computer America. A lot of fun. And be sure to tune in tomorrow where we do it all again. But tomorrow on the program, we will be talking with a company called Pure Imagination Studios. And yeah, they are a company that they actually produce a game called Alien Descent. And we're going to talk all about what they do, how they do it. This is going to be a creative show, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So, folks, until next time, have a great day. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Bye, everyone.